It's the year 1307, after his crushing defeat at the Battle of Methven in 1306, Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, is forced into exile with little more than a handful of men. Yet in the spring of 1307, King Robert returns with a small force, most likely recruited from the Western Isles of Scotland, and reignites his war against his English and Scottish enemies. The task of retaking Scotland would be immensely difficult, as Scotland at this point was largely occupied by the English, with most of the Scottish nobility pledging allegiance to King Edward of England. But to retake Scotland, King Robert knew he had to be bold and strike out in various locations around Scotland. And his invasions did just that, as he was not only landing his army in his ancestral homeland of Annandale, but was also sending another army, which was commanded by his two brothers, Thomas and Alexander, to Galloway. King Robert's initial landing was nearly a disaster, as the king instructed a spy to give a signal if the landing was safe. Yet King Robert saw a fire from the town and mistakenly thought that was a signal from the spy. Unfortunately, his forces landed near an English garrison led by a great enemy of the Scots, Henry Percy, who fought the Scots at Falkirk. But the Scottish forces avoided detection under the cover of night and made their way to the town of Turnberry, and upon arriving began to kill any English soldiers they could find. But King Robert lacked the equipment and men needed to besiege Turnberry Castle, so before Henry Percy could organise a counterattack, the Scots melted away into the night. This was a good start to King Robert's campaign, yet in Galloway the second invasion turned into a disaster, as shortly after landing, Alexander and Thomas's forces were quickly defeated by Dungal MacDougall, a fellow Scot. Alexander and Thomas were captured and then dragged to Carlisle before being promptly executed along with two Irish noblemen, Reginald Crawford and Malcolm McQuillan. Once again, friends and family paid the ultimate price for King Robert's ambition, yet despite the loss of his two brothers, Robert had little time to mourn, as the Earl of Pembroke was once again on the hunt for Robert. Yet Robert would not be caught off guard this time. No, he learnt the hard way of war at Methven. The only information Pembroke had of Robert's location was reports of raiding around Galloway. Pembroke's goal was to either catch Robert off guard or force him to fight in an open battlefield, as Pembroke knew Robert didn't have the numbers to create a standing army. Yet Robert was aware of this and began to use the Scottish terrain to his advantage, as numbers aren't everything in warfare. Pembroke's army soon reached Glentoul in April 1307. Glentoul is a narrow glen in Galloway. The terrain is difficult to manoeuvre across, especially with cavalry, as the steep slopes were dangerous and only one man at a time could march across the glen. The Scots were watching the English movements from the top of the glen. Now what happens next is debatable, as the only source on this battle is pro-Scottish and gives the following details. King Robert gives a signal to his men to push down several boulders, followed by an arrow barrage which killed many English. The Scots then charged down the slope, routing the English. For context, the slope is 700 meters and astonishingly steep, plus the English records only give a few horses lost. But regardless, King Robert had won a battle against the English, and could use this victory as a means of boosting his prestige and popularity among the Scottish people. Pembroke quickly regrouped his forces and gathered what men he could from nearby English garrisons before pursuing King Robert again, eventually finding him on the 10th of May at Loudoun Hill. King Robert had been recruiting men from the surrounding area and expected Pembroke to find him. Robert had been building a battle site that would benefit his army, as he only had spearmen and pikemen, but given the right terrain, they could be an effective force against the English heavy cavalry. The area in which the battle would be fought is similar to Glentoul, but King Robert's men modified the terrain by building trenches in and around the natural bog. The English army is estimated to have been 1,500 to 3,000 men strong, against King Robert's 600 men, with the English heavy cavalry leading at the front and the infantry at the back, as opposed to King Robert's pikemen and spearmen forming a schiltron. The English forces then split into two divisions, and without hesitation, the English heavy cavalry charged straight at the Scots, hoping their charge would break the Scots' line and send them in a panic. The chronicler Barber reports a great breaking of spears and screams of the wounded as the two sides clashed. King Robert and his last remaining brother, Edward Bruce, fought alongside their men in the schiltron, and thanks to the preparations the Scots took before the battle, they held firm and gradually started to inflict casualties on the English. After a few hours of fighting, the English were on the retreat, and Pembroke could only look on at the utter loss he just occurred. Knowing he couldn't force his way through the Scots, the Earl then organised his remaining men to head towards Bothwell. King Robert's plan had worked by forcing the English to fight in a restricted movement and funneling them towards a mass of spears. He could defeat the English. With 2 victories under his belt, King Robert could now make the case that he was here to stay and fight for Scotland, rather than being portrayed as a power-hungry noble. But now, Robert had to do 2 things. 1. Stay alive in order to promote his victories to the people and bring more men to his cause, and secondly, wait for King Edward to either die or arrive in Scotland with an army. Robert wouldn't have to wait long, as despite illness plaguing him, King Edward still managed to conscript an army and make his way towards Scotland. However, by the time Edward reached Carlisle, he was so exhausted he could only manage to march 2 miles a day before finally stopping to rest at Cumberland, not far from the Scottish border. But, finally, Edward's illness and age caught up with him, and on July the 7th, 1307, when his servants lifted to feed him, he died in their arms. Edward I of England, the hammer of the Scots, and one of the most powerful and ambitious kings of England, was dead. His death would have a profound effect